listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to philosopher and historian Dr. Émile P. Torres, alongside sociologist Professor Steve Fuller.
Thinking about human extinction, I think, couldn't be more relevant and timely, and it's extremely unfortunate that that is the case, that we happen to live in a moment in human history where human extinction is just like absolutely imaginable.
Émile and Steve shared their thoughts on the history of human extinction, how apocalyptic narratives inform culture, and what it means to live in the end times. You may know Émile P. Torres as @xriskology on Twitter, and for having coined the acronym TESCREAL with ex-Google computer scientist Dr. Timit Gebru. It was created to refer to a constellation of several overlapping futurist philosophies which have recently become popular in Silicon Valley, and many of which have been explored on this podcast. They include transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. Thus, TESCREAL, or TESCREAL. Although Émile has increasingly come to consider these ideologies, in their own words, philosophically flawed and quite potentially dangerous, Émile wasn't always a critic of the future. I first discovered their work through their numerous articles in academic journals and popular media outlets about human enhancement, machine intelligence, and the future of humanity. They were always insightful and provided well-researched historical viewpoints on some of the most controversial aspects of these ambitions. It's why I was so excited to learn that they had recently written a Routledge book on the history of the science and ethics of human extinction and annihilation. In short, an introduction to eschatology, the beliefs concerning death and the end of the world. Late last year, Émile was in the UK promoting the book, and I extended an invite to have them come visit the University of Warwick to record a podcast in person, which they kindly accepted. As such, you can watch a full video version of this episode on YouTube using the link in the description. Joining Émile is my PhD supervisor and regular guest on the show, Professor Steve Fuller. I asked Steve to participate as he runs a joint undergraduate and postgraduate university module on human extinction called the Sociology of End Times. I took this module myself in 2002, and it's one that covers a wide range of challenging topics over the course of 10 weeks. It starts by tackling how both the theological idea of humanity's fallen nature, as well as the secular ideas of progress, influence our understanding of the end of the world. From there, it goes on to explore how the Cold War influenced the end times narrative, how violence might be necessary to rebalance world order and prevent the end of the world, analyzes the narratives around the decline of the West and the increasing dominance of China, explores transhumanism as a way to overcome adversity in the modern age, and finally asks how we might rebuild the world if collapse is, indeed, inevitable. It's a whirlwind exploration of the various narratives and theories related to human destiny, progress, and the potential end of civilization. It leaves all options on the table. And that's encapsulated in the essay title Steve assigns his students at the end of the module. Should the world begin anew? It is a provocation that asks students to explore many of the themes covered in this episode, and perhaps a question you might find yourself pondering after listening to the show. As such, there are a couple of key ideas to pay attention to. The first half of the show covers the intellectual history of human extinction, exploring how perceptions about the possibility and inevitability of human extinction has changed over time. Torres and Fuller outline how the discourse around end times has been shaped by a transition from a belief in humanity's indestructibility to an acknowledgement of possible extinction, and explores what informs this change in humanity's outlook on its future. The second half of this conversation explores existential ethics, outlining the philosophical perspectives on whether a certain type of extinction is morally right or wrong, and whether it is possible to make the argument that extinction is desirable or essential. To help us understand this, Torres breaks down the different types of human extinction: demographic, phyletic, terminal, final, normative, and premature extinction. In doing so, they show how not all forms of extinction would lead to the end of the human as we have come to understand it. Unfortunately, this feels like a particularly relevant conversation to have in the current times, and that's why I'm so pleased to welcome Dr. Émile Torres and Professor Steve Fuller to the Futures Podcast. Émile Torres, you've written the book on human extinction, and the question I have to begin with is this term human and extinction together, they mean something to a lot of people. This idea that humanity will come to an end, but we have to ask the question of what is human and I guess what is extinction. So how would you approach that?
I think for a lot of people, the concept of human extinction seems pretty straightforward, but it turns out that it's quite ambiguous. And it's ambiguous because the term human can have many different meanings, as well as the term extinction. So you put those together, and then you have this sort of matrix of possibilities, which I think ends up being something like, at least 20 different interpretations of what human extinction could mean. So yeah, in the book, I take one term at a time and begin with this notion of human, which, it could mean, a whole bunch of different things. Sort of retrospectively, looking backwards, it, could encompass all of the different species within the genus of Homo. So the genus of Homo emerged something like 2.6 million years ago with Homo habilis, and then there was, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo neanderthalensis, and so on. There's, a large number of human species, including Homo sapiens, of course. So if you ask an anthropologist, they're going to say human is equivalent to Homo, this taxonomic category. I think the most intuitive sense is to just equate human with Homo sapiens. If you ask, the random person on the street, that's probably what they're going to say. But then pivoting towards the future and considering the space of future possibilities with respect to our evolution moving forward, you find futurists have kind of an equally expansive definition as the anthropologists, but again, sort of futurologically rather than anthropologically looking backwards. And so one of the definitions you find in the literature that I think falls within the domain that I'm calling existential ethics, the study of whether human extinction would be right or wrong, good or bad, better or worse, is that human includes Homo sapiens and whatever descendants we might have. So any sort of future population that is causally or genealogically related to us in the right sort of way, that those entities count as humans. So, I mean, the implication is that Homo sapiens could disappear, but we have give rise to this sort of post-human species in the future. And in that sense, humanity continues. So maybe it's worth mentioning right away that there's terminological confusion here, because there are transhumanists, for example, who would classify certain types of future beings as post-humans, but also they accept a definition of human such that those post-humans fall within the extension of human. So they're both post-human and they're human. And this is just a terminological problem and confusion that I note in the book, but don't really make any effort to actually navigate or propose an alternative. So anyways, that's for future work. So if there's students, listening to this, this is a future project. This is a terminological conundrum that needs to be resolved. So other futurists define human as any future beings that we have the right causal or genealogical relation to, that also possess the right sort of moral status. So they add this sort of normative component to the definition. So if there are, for example, future post-humans who lack the capacity for consciousness, and if it's the case that consciousness is necessary for for entities to have a certain kind of moral status, then those entities won't count as human. In that sense, there will be no more humans, and so human extinction would have happened. So, yeah, so there's just a multiplicity of different ways of defining this term human, and I think that's important for understanding what exactly one could mean by human extinction, and what exactly it is that some prominent voices right now, for example, in the discussion about AGI and the existential risk posed by it, mean by human extinction. So, okay, so that's just one term. Moving on to extinction, I think that there are at least 6 distinct extinction scenarios that are relevant ethically, evaluatively, historically, and futurologically. In the book, I list these. I examine each in some degree of detail. Basically, they are demographic. These are terms that I'm borrowing in part from evolutionary biology, but also then introducing my own terms, because I think some of these scenarios are completely unique to the case of humanity. And they're just not applicable to non-human entities. So there's demographic, phyletic, terminal, final, normative, and premature. And so to go through these briefly, demographic extinction, I think, is the most intuitive sense. This is just when the human population drops to zero. So that could happen very quickly if there's like a sudden global catastrophe. It could happen very slowly, maybe over the course of centuries if there's some kind of infertility scenario. And, then the human population just dwindles very incrementally. So that's demographic. Phyletic is where Homo sapiens ceases to exist because we have evolved into something else. So our evolutionary lineage persists, whereas with demographic extinction, our evolutionary lineage terminates. So with phyletic extinction, that lineage continues, but Homo sapiens no longer exists. So this could happen as a result of just Darwinian, natural selection, Darwinian mechanisms, random mutation, genetic drift, and so on. Given enough time, we will become a post-human species. Maybe it'll be hundreds of thousands of years or so, but that's just going to happen. But also we could use technology, to modify ourselves and to engineer a new post-human species. So this is the process of cyborgization. Maybe the logical end of that is where we completely replace our biological substrate with something technological, through mind uploading or something like that. So in that case, we, meaning Homo sapiens, would have gone extinct, but only by virtue of just becoming something else. So that's phyletic. Terminal extinction adds a condition of permanence. And so it's compatible with both demographic and phyletic extinction. And it just says that we disappear not just entirely, as is the case with both phyletic and demographic, but also permanently. And so this is mostly important for historical reasons, because there were people in the past, in particular some like ancient Greek pre-Socratic philosophers, who imagined, in fact, they posited as part of their cosmological models that at some point in the future, humanity will completely disappear. But also by virtue of the fundamental nature of the cosmic order, will always reappear. So we undergo demographic extinction without undergoing terminal extinction. And that has happened, the implication is that has happened an infinite number of times in the past and will happen an infinite number of times in the future. So that's terminal extinction. There's also futurological reasons why this distinction might be relevant, but maybe I'll bracket them for now. Okay, so final extinction is just where we disappear entirely and forever. And a third criterion, we don't leave behind any successors. And this is important because many people would argue that what happens after we, for example, Homo sapiens, disappears, what happens after that makes a huge difference for one's assessment of the badness of that scenario. So if we, for example, are replaced by some population of intelligent machines, then they would claim that wouldn't be bad. Others would disagree, maybe vociferously, but this is one view. So final extinction, so they would say terminal extinction is not in itself, inherently bad. Final extinction is, if we disappear, but we give rise to some post-human species or a population of intelligent machines that carry on our values, that have the capacity for conscious experiences and so on, then terminal extinction just wouldn't be bad. But final extinction, which would preclude those future beings from existing, that would be very bad. So that brings us to normative extinction, which is where those normative definitions of humanity are really important. So you could imagine there being some population of future beings, intelligent machines. Maybe they carry on our scientific projects, they create arts and so on, but they lack the capacity for conscious experience. And so they're philosophical zombies, as philosophers say. And consequently, they lack a certain kind of moral status. Hence, they don't count as human. And them not counting as human is sufficient for human extinction in just the most minimal definition to be instantiated. So, yeah, if your notion of humanity is like beings that are conscious and are genealogically or causally related to us, and these future beings aren't conscious, they're no longer human, therefore human extinctions happen. And that premature extinction just adds this notion that timing matters. So maybe they'll say like, and it presupposes some kind of teleological vision of the future. So, if we undergo final extinction, for example, after attaining some desired end state, some telos, they might say that would be very bad. But if human extinction were to happen before that, it would be much worse. So that's the notion of premature extinction, which is very prominent in a lot of discussions of existential risk. And yeah, it's actually the most recent conception of human extinction, but it's very salient in contemporary discussions among existential risk scholars. So I hope that was useful, and I apologize if I went on for too long about the details of these distinctions.
But I think it's important because the question we need to ask when we talk about human extinction is the question of what is coming to an end and how it might come to an end. And that's why that definition of human is so important, because you're talking about maybe humans will leave the stage, but intelligent machines will replace those human beings, but they may also have the moral status of a human. So this becomes a much more complicated issue, doesn't it, Steve?
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to say that I think what Émile has done here is actually give a fairly comprehensive and accurate picture of, you might say, the state of play in this matter in terms of the default positions that people are coming from when thinking about human extinction. So I'm not going to contest that aspect of it. I do want to draw attention to certain aspects that I find kind of, let's put it this way, idiosyncratic to our times. In terms of how to think about this matter. And so what I'm going to be getting at here is that there is a pre- or non-biological conception of the human. Okay, that's where I'm going with this. And I think that needs to be put on the table as a kind of counterpoint. But the way to get there, given what Émile has said, is to think about, as he was scoping out what the human is, he basically made 2 points. One point was to say, well, if you ask an ordinary person what a human is, they'll say Homo sapiens, right? That was the first move. And then the second move was to say give a kind of evolutionary story that whoever's causally or genealogically connected to this being, right, also can count as human, at least can qualify as human. What I would say about this is it's an interesting combination of moves from a philosophical standpoint, because by appealing to the ordinary person in the beginning, right? So you're not actually appealing to science in the beginning, because I think from a strictly biological or evolutionary standpoint, there is no clear distinction between human and non-human. Right? I mean, so that's the first point. You start with a kind of ordinary notion that you're assuming your audience will buy into, and then you immediately move into this scientific stuff. That's kind of interesting, maybe a little suspect, but it's an interesting kind of way of framing the issue, because it's neither consistently scientific nor consistently commonsensical. It's kind of a hybrid sort of conceptual idea about what the human is. And also the other thing I would also draw attention to is you say that if you ask an ordinary person, they'll say a human is a Homo sapiens. But actually, if you thought about that sociologically, in other words, if you actually did ask ordinary people who counts as a human and not human, I think they might leave a lot of Homo sapiens out. So in other words, it's a sort of, your sense of the ordinary person is a kind of normative conception of the ordinary person. It might not actually represent the full range of ordinary people where they'd ask, to be asked the question about, who's, because I can easily imagine, and it happens all the time, that ordinary people consider certain Homo sapiens as being, inhuman. Right? And this is where I want to get to the idea of a non-biological conception of the human. Because when they say stuff like that, regardless of whether their judgments are justified or not, they're kind of thinking about human not so much as an entity, but as a concept, right? Or a set of properties, perhaps, that in a sense are semi-detached from the entities, you might say. And so there is no automatic, there's no way in which you can just, as you would put it, you can't just give an extensional definition. Mm-hmm. Right? Because in philosophy, when you give an extensional definition of something, you're basically enumerating the members of the set, right? And and so you're talking about entities. But supposing human is a property or a concept, and it can be applied in many different ways, and it can attach to many different types of beings under certain kinds of conditions, right? Then you get a kind of different look to the human and then what it might mean. So the closest thing actually that gets to the conceptual side of the conceptual definition of the human in what you said was when you were talking about, these zombies, right? And that they lacked a sort of essential property of the human, which was being conscious. So let's just take that point at face value. I don't know if I actually buy this point, but the point is that was the only moment where you defined human in something like a conceptual or a property attribution way rather than a particular entity. Okay. And I thought that was kind of interesting, actually. But that would, see, for me, when I come into the issue about what it means to be human, I start from the conceptual property-based standpoint because I'm imagining, look, I'm not just imagining, it is a fact that the term human was being applied long before human got identified with Homo sapiens. Right? It only happens in the mid-18th century. So, all kinds of things were being attributed human properties. And while it might be convenient to say now, in light of evolutionary theory, to say, well, those were just anthropomorphisms, right? We were projecting human qualities on animals or whatever. As a matter of fact, it seems to me that that's not how the people who were using human would have thought about it. They didn't think they were playing around with metaphors, right? They were actually making literal attributions about beings that had human quality. So a dog could have a human quality, if you look at Aesop's fables and stuff like that, right? What's human about these things are the qualities that these beings evince, even though they're differently embodied, right? And this is a kind of this then puts a different spin. Kind of, and if you look at the Greeks, and not the pre-Socratic Greeks, but if you look at Plato, Aristotle, and then you look at the Stoics and the Christian tradition and so forth, being human is often it's usually a process of becoming human. Right. So in other words, a certain kind of being who may be an upright ape, right? Actually has to undergo an education, has to undergo a certain kind of training, and has to adopt a certain kind of comportment in dealing with the world and dealing with others. Right. So Aristotle, zoon politikon, right? An animal who can do politics, basically, right? A person who can stand up for themselves. I mean, that's kind of what he was getting at. And that's the human. Right. So in other words, the quality and the thing are kind of semi-detached. Right. And this is where things like education have historically played a very important role in the humanization of people, which is where the concept of humanities as a set of disciplines come from. When we talk about the humanities as a kind of foundational academic discipline, it is about the process by which, right, certain beings become human. And see, when you start from that space, then in a sense, it's not only that it kind of has you looking at a longer past, but it also has you looking at the future in a somewhat different way. So, for example, it might make one a bit more liberal with regard to attributing human qualities to machines, right? If especially if we start introducing Turing test type things, right? Where in a sense, if you can't tell the difference, then why doesn't it pass as human? And you might even, at some point when we're able to develop interfaces, with animals where we can communicate more directly mind to mind in a kind of, Neuralink way, maybe, that then we might start, all of this Aesop's fable stuff might start to make some sense again. And then at that point, the concept of the human then gets more variously attributed, and it isn't so closely tied to particular entities. So, in a sense, humanity could continue without the upright ape being around in a fairly imagined way. One could imagine that it would, and it might not even be too disturbing. You see, and at that point, then a lot of the sting of human extinction goes out the window, because so much of the sting of human extinction, you didn't bring this up, but I'm sure you will at some point, is that it's very much tied to the condition of the body and the possibility of suffering and pain. Mm-hmm. Right, and that this is kind of the thing that makes people, at least in the first stage, not want it to happen, right? And so but if you have a much more kind of looser idea of the modes of embodiment of humanity, then some of this pain and suffering stuff might not seem so important either. But that's opening up a large can of worms there. But that's kind of would be my opening countermove to this.
From what you're saying there, Steve, there's two things at play. There's the reason why human extinction could be bad because of the pain and the suffering, but also it's the end of the existence of certain properties that represent what human is. But you're also saying human is a property in of itself.
No, well, this is the thing. I think this is where the consciousness question comes in, I think, because we don't have a clear... if you read all these Greeks and all these people who were talking about humanizing people, right, or humanizing beings, right? I mean, there are certain kinds of attributes that tend to pop up, right? But reflectiveness, capacity for reflection, often compassion. I mean, the ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. There are these kinds of issues, but we don't have a definitive list. And that's kind of interesting. But it seems to me we could do a kind of, we could have a theory of that. Let's put it that way. And then one could think about the conditions under which that set of properties would be rendered impossible to be, embodied or manifested or expressed, right? And not be so concerned about the existence of particular beings, but rather that all the properties disappear. And that's why the business about zombies is actually touches on that, right? Because if you take consciousness to be one of the definitive properties of being human, right? And then you have these successor beings that have a lot of the characteristics. They can do science and art and all that jazz, right? But they don't have consciousness, right? These zombies, and they're not human if consciousness is one of the essential properties of being human. The problem, though, I would say with consciousness, especially in the way you seem to be using it, I don't want to get you wrong, but it's a bit question begging, right? Because if we're not around, if we're already out of the picture by the time these zombies are on the scene, how do we know they're not conscious?
Yeah, I don't know.
Sorry, I didn't go on.
But that's what thinking about this sort of idea provokes is these larger questions of what it means to be human, or perhaps in the way in which you're phrasing it, Steve, it's less of a human being and more of a human doing. That's the thing that we want to preserve. But Émile, I want to turn back to you to ask that question of, the idea of human extinction, that emerged from somewhere, and it emerged from the human, and it's emerged in different ways throughout time, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Is it useful to give like a brief summary of the history of thinking about human extinction? So I think the idea... So first of all, I don't know. Thank you for all the comments. There's a lot of fascinating stuff that you brought up, and perhaps we'll swing back to some of those.
Yeah, don't
issues.
worry.
Yeah. I think the idea of human extinction really dates back to. So on the one hand, it's like, how do you define it? Well, if you focus on just like a minimal definition, where there are, as philosophers would say, there are no tokens of the type. There were at T1, there aren't at some later point T2. This notion goes back to the pre-Socratics, and I'd already gestured at this before. There were various figures back, in ancient Greece. Xenophanes is an example. Empedocles is another. Then later there were the Stoics. There were also the ancient Greek atomists who held an interesting and more complex view than Xenophanes and Empedocles. But basically, they posited these cyclical models of cosmic evolution. And part of these cycles were periods during which no humans exist. But then again, after that, we always reappear. So it's demographic extinction without ever terminal extinction. That's interesting. The idea, and maybe the idea can be traced back even earlier. In the book, I mentioned some myths from ancient Egypt and, other places in the world. So the idea, it sort of makes a debut back then. But nonetheless, and this I think is important, there was still an assumption of our fundamental indestructibility. Maybe that's because of some deeper underlying tendency towards a sort of anthropocentrism, according to which we just can't imagine a universe without us, but maybe temporarily, but never permanently. So there was, still this notion that we are fundamentally indestructible. And then I claim that with the rise of Christianity, which really became very widespread in the Roman Empire in the 4th, 5th centuries of the Common Era, this notion of indestructibility took on an even more radical form. And so human extinction, even in this most minimal sense, was rendered more or less completely unthinkable. And that persisted really up until the 19th century. And so in the book, I argue that there are basically 3 reasons that this idea of human extinction was just blocked, was completely occluded, was made just an unintelligible impossibility. That's what people would have described it as. One is just the great chain of being. It's this sort of model of the structure of reality that strikes us as very strange today, but was hugely influential for a very long period of time. Has roots that go back to Plato and Aristotle, but it was really put together for the first time by the Neoplatonists in the 3rd, 4th century, again, of the Common Era. And so basically the idea is that, every type of thing that can exist in the universe does. And it's not the case that any type can be uninstantiated at any point. The fullness of the great chain is evidence of God's perfection. Therefore, any missing chain, even for a moment, would indicate that God is imperfect. But God is perfect. Therefore, no chain can go missing. So that was sort of the line of reasoning.
And the things on that chain are gods, angels, humans, animals, objects, minerals. Yeah.
Exactly right. So in the Christianized version of the great chain, you've got God at the top, angelic beings, humans, like you said, animals, and then transitional forms called zoophytes. So people can look up the Lamb of Tartar. It was the supposed tree that would grow sheep as fruit, and so this was, people took this seriously for a long time. After all, it made sense. If there's got to be some transitional entities between animals and plants, and then you got minerals at the bottom. So exactly right. So that was one reason. Also, there was this notion that humans are immortal. And since humanity is just the sum total of all humans, if every individual human is immortal, then humanity as a whole is immortal. So that was a second reason associated with Christianity, an idea, a belief that was at the core of Christian doctrine that also rendered this idea an unintelligible impossibility. And then the last reason gets at an important distinction between the notion of religious apocalypse and this idea of human extinction as we sort of understand it today, where, according to Christian eschatology, just the end times narrative, literally eschatology means study of last things. At the end of time, humanity will persist through the cataclysmic paroxysms of Armageddon and the rise of the Antichrist and so on, and will persist in such that believers will enter heaven forever with God, unbelievers will enter perdition and spend eternity. But humanity survives. So a central feature of the religious apocalypse is this notion of transformation, whereas with the qualifications of the typology that I outlined earlier, a central feature of this notion of human extinction is termination. So all of that is to say that a third reason, in addition to the great chain of being, this notion of human immortality, is this eschatological idea that humans play an integral role in the unfolding of God's grand plan for the universe. And so it's not clear how this plan can, therefore, unfold without us, which implies that we just can't disappear. I mean, how would the scales of cosmic justice be balanced? There are lots of wicked people in the world who get away with their wickedness. They're the righteous who, end up finishing last and so on. And so our world right now is patently unjust. The whole point of the end times, many would argue, is theodicy. It's to vindicate the existence of evil and throughout history, and to ultimately balance those scales of cosmic justice. If humanity's out of the picture, how does that happen? So this is a third reason. So as Christianity emerged, it brought with it this Christianized notion of the great chain, this what I call the ontological thesis, this notion that we're immortal, therefore humanity is immortal, and then this eschatological idea that the human extinction, as we understand, is just not on the cards for us. And so that dominated for 1,500 years until really kind of the mid-19th century, when Western societies began to secularize. And for the first time, mostly among the educated class, Christianity became seen as indefensible, as untenable, due to scientific breakthroughs like Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, published in 1859. But also there were various other factors that are responsible for secularization. And then, right as Western society was secularizing and conceptual space was starting to open up for people to go, oh, actually human extinction, maybe it's possible, at least in principle, scientists discovered the second law of thermodynamics. And it is extraordinary that immediately after the discovery of the second law, in the very early 1850s, scientists and then very rapidly people outside of the field of physics and the public more generally recognized that the implication of the second law is that Earth will at some point become completely uninhabitable. So this was really a double trauma, because on the one hand, this notion that had dominated for 1,500 years, that human extinction is just fundamentally impossible, that eroded significantly. And so people started, as I mentioned before, people started to think maybe human extinction could actually happen. But there's a second question. Do we live in a world where this will actually happen in the future? So maybe something is possible in principle, but it just can't happen. Maybe the laws of physics are such that it cannot happen. Maybe there are just other purely contingent reasons that prevent this thing from happening, even if it's possible in principle. So at the same time, you've got the possibility of human extinction being widely recognized, the discovery of the second law, which says not only that our extinction is possible and could actually happen in this universe, but it's inevitable in the long run. So that was a real double trauma.
So I actually don't disagree with what you characterize, and especially when you brought in the issues about eschatology and theodicy is actually stuff I've been covering for the last couple of weeks. So so this is in fact quite germane to the whole end times issue in a very, very deep way. But one of the things that I think ends up serving your argument in the way in which Christianity functions here And is that, so I was saying in response to you initially that, human is really like a set of properties or a concept and it's not an entity. But Christianity really complicates the story on this because, of course, there is an entity that is human, but also divine. That's called Jesus. And I think that ends up then, in a way, from the very beginning, creating a lot of these kinds of questions which things like theodicy tried to answer and eschatology tried to answer, right? So the idea being that if in some sense Jesus is some kind of a sign about, what the creation is about and where it's going and all the rest of it, the fact that it is a human sign, that is Jesus being presented as the Son of God, right, with a lot of human qualities, recognizably human qualities to other humans, right? He's not being presented as just an angel or something, or let alone anything more abstract or spiritual in the usual sense. That immediately then gets people going this way, right? Because in some sense, they think that something about our humanity and that human beings, right, is essential. We have to understand that in order to figure out where it's all going, right? And so in this respect, humans as the entity human, right, the Homo sapiens human, the human that Jesus looked like or was or whatever, becomes constitutive, right, becomes necessary feature of how the world is going to go and how it's all going to end and all the rest of it. So in that sense, humans have got to be around, right? This then becomes the argument for humans sticking around because they are going to be delivering, as it were, God's plan, just as and Jesus is kind of a foreshadowing of that, right? So this makes the Homo sapiens style human quite essential, and why I can see why you would say, therefore, there is no conception of human extinction, right, in this kind of Christian way of seeing things, right? So I take this to be your argument, and it certainly does draw attention to the way in which Christians highlight not just a set of properties as being human, but specific entities as being human, right? Jesus and the particular people who were going to be judged at the end of time, right? Because Christianity has this thing about the last judgment, and what's being judged, it's not a set of properties. What's being judged are particular individuals who've lived, right? So this does, I could see this kind of making gives your argument some ammunition, I think. I want to now move to when you move into the 19th century and you talk about entropy, I think you mentioned it by name, but if not, the second law of thermodynamics, as it's normally called, right? So this idea that the heat death of the universe, right? That in a sense the laws of thermodynamics mean that all order will eventually get into disorder, and it's an irreversible process, right? So we don't have any of this cosmic recycling that the atomists were into, but rather we have a kind of permanent meltdown. Right, this is the image that got all these late 19th century guys very agitated and depressed and pessimistic, and you talk about that. One of the things I would draw attention to here, which is kind of interesting because you go into the various flavors of extinctionism, and the people who really lean on the second law of thermodynamics, in a way, are kind of, if I may put it this way, overkill with regard to extinction, right? Because it's not just the human extinction; it's kind of the extinction of life, right? The extinction of any kind of organized matter, right? That is kind of what the image is of this world, right? It'll be random. Everything will be random molecules, random atoms, whatever, right? And the reason why I'm bringing this up, and maybe this will be some further question you'll bring up here, is about the character of extinctionism today, right? Because one person you don't mention, but I think is kind of a very interesting person on the extinctionism front, and Luke will know, Patricia McCormick, right? Patricia McCormick, you familiar with her?
I'm not.
Okay. She's an antinatalist, so you do bring it up in the book. She's one of the more antinatalists.
He doesn't bring her up by name. I mean, she wrote this. What I would recommend to you and listeners out there, she has this thing called the A Human Manifesto, which came out 1 month before COVID. It was brilliant timing. But the thing that she argues, and I think this is quite characteristic of a lot of the contemporary extinctionists, who I think would regard the second law of the thermodynamics approach as overkill, because what they want to privilege life over the human, right? For them, in a sense, getting rid of human life enables all other forms of life to flourish, right? That's kind of what their general strategy is. But what they would hate would be if all life disappeared. Right, that would be really bad. That would be the ultimate nightmare. Yeah. Okay, but what they would prefer is just for human life to disappear, and this is part of the Anthropocene thinking, right? Right, where the humans are the cause of all the environmental disasters and crises in the world, getting rid of half the species on the planet, all that jazz, right? I mean, she's coming from there, and see, that's a really different way of pursuing extinctionism from these thermodynamic guys, which basically will obliterate everything, not just humans. Right, she actually is targeting humans as the thing that needs to go, and it's a moral argument.
Yeah, well, I think she's whether it's the antinatalist, the pro-mortalism, or the omnicide approach. I think what she's attacking is human culture only presents or emerges from human beings. So if we got rid of human beings, culture as it exists today would go with it, and then perhaps something else would emerge.
Yeah,
but
I mean,
it may be in the human form. I think she was
I think anything that has, 'cause this is the thing, right? Anything that would have the trace of the human and the potential for becoming human would again recycle the problem, right? So this is a very profound anti-humanism, right? And a pro-human extinction stand that is quite laser-like in its target. It doesn't want, because the point is the thermodynamics guy are very that bit scattershot. Yeah. It's all life that's going to go.
Yeah. So this is an interesting version of antinatalism because there are different flavors, right? And David Benatar, for example, his focus is less on our environmental impact, although he does discuss that, and more on the suffering of human existence. But it's actually I would amend what I just said and say it's really just about the experience of suffering in general. So he does hold a view that is perhaps similar in a certain respect with the people who worried about thermodynamics, in that he ultimately wants all life to not exist.
Because it's a source of suffering. The only way you have suffering is if you live. Schopenhauer.
Yeah, it's one of the properties of being human is suffering. Yeah.
Well, no, it's one of the properties of living is suffering, because if you're an animal, right, you have sensation, and sensation is going to be, an opportunity for pain at every turn. No, this is Schopenhauer. It's even there before thermodynamics.
I think probably the most fascinating example of this, Benatar mostly focuses on the claim that humans should stop procreating. He says that ideally all other creatures would stop procreating as well, but maybe that's too much to ask. But the most fascinating example of this...
Why does he think that? Is there like a dog, watching, what are these humans doing so we can do it too? Is that what he thinks?
I mean, perhaps he would argue that if there's some way we could use technology to then intervene in the natural world more generally.
Mass sterilization.
You mean eugenics, dysgenics, right? Eugenics, negative eugenics.
Yeah. And so, but I think there was this latter 19th century philosopher, Edward von Hartmann, who I discussed in the book. And yeah, his, he has just this really fascinating, bizarre, extreme kind of omnicidal vision, because he also is like, if humanity gets rid of itself, that doesn't solve the problem. There are other creatures, they're going to evolve into, maybe a human state. Maybe also there are beings elsewhere in the universe. And in fact, the latter 19th century, this idea that the universe is populated by intelligent beings all over the place, it's the plurality of worlds idea. That was the canonical view. That was orthodoxy. So it sounds strange to us today, but like pretty much everybody believed in aliens. And so he said, there could be these beings.
Well, the panspermia movement begins as part of that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, ultimately his view is that Schopenhauer is completely wrong about his aestheticism and so on. That leads to quietism. People sort of withdraw from society and so on. Also, his fellow German pessimists who are antinatalists, they're completely wrong. What we want to do is have more children, further develop society, culture and technology and so on. Why? Because ultimately that'll put us in a position to figure out how we can annihilate the very possibility of life within the entire universe.
Nick Land.
acceleration.
That's right. This is nickel and country.
So yeah, I don't know. Fascinating. And another thing worth mentioning is I absolutely take your point about this, the notion of humanity being much richer than I suggest in the book. So again, in writing this like really large manuscript, I was constantly thinking, this paragraph, that could be a research paper on its own. Yeah. But for the purposes of the book, like hopefully this is good enough. And so I was really focused on sort of contemporary existential ethics. That's why this typology introduces the second half of the book, which is focused entirely on the ethical and evaluative aspects of human extinction. But you're totally right. And even just another thing to add to the mix, some have argued that, I'm forgetting the historian's name off the top of my head. It'll come to me as soon as I stop trying to think of it. But he wrote this fascinating book where he argues that our contemporary notion of humanity with a capital H is how he spells it. MIT historian Bruce Maslish.
Yeah, Bruce Maslish.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so he argues that this notion of humanity with a capital H, according to which all individual members of within the extension of humanity are there by virtue of their possessing a certain kind of inherent dignity. And so this is a common idea these days. It's what animates the notion of crimes against humanity. Mm-hmm. And so he traces this back to really like to World War I, mm-hmm. when it first appeared with the Armenian genocide. Mm-hmm. And that was when this idea of crimes against humanity, although the term goes back much earlier to like the Belgian genocide in the Congo and so on, but it really sort of took shape following the Armenian genocide. And then it wasn't until the Nuremberg trials that this rich normative notion of human extinction in connection with our fundamental ineradicable dignity really take shape. So anyways, I mean, that is yet another notion of humanity.
The role of genocide. Yeah, this is an interesting point, actually, because this term genocide actually is one of the things that gets coined from the Nuremberg trials. The term didn't really exist before then. And then it got retrospectively applied to the Armenian massacre and all the rest of it. Yeah, that's an interesting angle, because it's, if you read something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and you see a word like dignity, it's very easy to kind of think, oh, this is kind of like the classical notion of dignity, the Stoics and people like that. But those notions of dignity didn't have this strong emphasis on, you might say, the territorial integrity of the body. Right? Because the whole point about Stoicism, right, was that you could retain your dignity in spite of all of the things being done to your body. Right? I mean, Stoicism, is about grace under pressure, basically. But the point about this kind of modern notion of dignity that you're talking about is that it is very closely tied to the body, right? And in fact, when you get into all these debates in human experimentation and bioethics these days, right? Dignity becomes kind of the flashpoint word, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. Where Steven Pinker is saying, dignity is rubbish, let's go in there, into the labs and do stuff to people, and then people start worrying about, their bodies being in some way invaded and this is a relatively modern way of looking at dignity that is tied to this very highly embodied notion of the human being. And it is connected to the genocide issue.
And yeah, so there is yet this other notion of humanity. And, how does that tie into like the idea of normative extinction? This was briefly gestured at during the second half of the 20th century, and then mostly sort of forgotten. So like Karl Jaspers, for example, he was famously an advocate of the better dead than red mm-hmm. Idea, mm-hmm. so the slogan. Mm-hmm. And so this is the idea that if the US, if democratic, capitalist, free societies, as it were to be taken over by communist totalitarian states, that would deprive us of fundamental properties that make us human, such as our freedom. I believe Jasper's emphasize in particular our freedom, but you could also say, our dignity, our autonomy, and so on. And so by extinguishing these properties, humanity ceases to exist. Well, on a minimal definition of human extinction, you might argue that that sort of constitutes a kind of extinction, a sort of normative extinction. And then he made the further claim, which is really quite interesting, that essentially, applying my own terminology to what he said, final human extinction, whereby all humans just cease to exist, that would be preferable to this other kind of normative extinction. So if we have to choose between the two, press the launch button, send all the thermonuclear weapons back towards the Soviet Union if they initiate a first strike, annihilate everything. That's better than them winning the war and us continuing to exist in some kind of physical sense, but being deprived of these fundamental properties that make us human, and consequently that make life worthwhile.
It's interesting. I didn't quite realize he said that, given the kind of guy he is. But this is actually kind of the way in which revolutionaries normally think, right? Revolutionaries normally think in terms of, it's better not to be around at all than to live this kind of animal existence, because the human, and here, of course, the human is being identified normatively as something that rises above just an animal existence, right? Because the background assumption, in terms of, you might say Western images of Soviet communism, right, was that you'd be in an animal-like state, right, in various ways. Not only would you be subjugated, but you wouldn't have opportunities for free expression. I mean, there would all be all these, but you'd live, right? The point is you would live in a certain kind of way, right? But it wouldn't be fit for a human. Maybe for an animal, but not for a human, in which case then it is better to be completely gone. And that's been very much, if you look at what, emancipatory movements, revolutionary movements, where people are trying to, cast aside their chains and stuff like that. That's why they're willing to risk their lives, right? That's why they're willing to risk their lives, because of a normative conception of humanity, right? And they would rather just die than, as it were, to lose the war and have to live, in the regime of the victor.
So in other words,
Totally.
Human extinction is very easy if all you want to do is get rid of the human term. So dehumanization is the easiest way towards human extinction, by getting rid of the notion of the human.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you see, this is the thing. I mean,
we can do it without thermonuclears.
Well,
We can do it with philosophy instead.
Yeah. See, but this is where the whole Cold War experience becomes very interesting, because that was always the way it was taught, right? So the Cold War is where this, in a way reflecting, some of the knowledge that became clear about how the Nazis were operating. But the Cold War was just full of this talk of dehumanization, right? And everyone, all sorts of coming from all sorts of political positions, right? We're kind of arguing a version of this, right? That we don't want to live in a dehumanized way. Living itself is not sufficient value to stick around. We have to live as humans.
So in other words, death is pretty much exactly the same as not being human in that context. It's just as equally morally bad.
No. It's worse to live even in a Homo sapiens body if you can't live as a
human.
Yeah.
So death might be better
exactly
than existing in a dehumanized state. So
exactly,
that's the idea with better dead than red.
Yeah, and that was common. Everybody was. I mean, it wasn't, and it was also being said from all kinds of places, not just the democratic capitalist ones, but everyone was kind of giving a version of this kind of story.
Well, let's turn to the question of whether it's morally right or wrong to cause extinction, because that's the big question mark in the room. It's the big question mark that you give your students, Steve, in the End Times module. It's should we begin
Should we reboot the world?
Yeah. Should we reboot the world? Because, again, from what I'm hearing from both of you, it feels like whether these things are morally right or wrong depends on whether you believe there is some grand plan for the human. What are some of the things, Émile, that we need to consider before we even ask that question?
Yeah, I think the first question, as I've argued, is when someone queries you with would human extinction be bad, for example, there are many different variations of that question. You should ask, well, what do you mean by human? And what do you mean by extinction? Which type of extinction are we talking about? There are some people out there, like some transhumanists, who might say that if Homo sapiens disappears because we've evolved into something superior, some superior post-human species, that form of extinction would be great. But if we undergo final extinction and consequently we foreclose, what could be like just a marvelous, to quote Toby Ord, transhumanist, long-termist, our vast and glorious future, then that would be very bad. So on this, the same view can coherently say this type of extinction would be great under these circumstances. This other type of extinction would be terrible. So it's just important to disambiguate the question right away. So that being said, I think there's another set of distinctions which are orthogonal to this typology of extinction scenarios, which is the difference between the process or event of going extinct and the state or condition of being extinct. And sort of in writing this book, I was a bit astonished that nobody had really articulated this distinction before, because it's very fundamental. It parallels a distinction within the ethical subfield focused on death. That is the death of the individual, whereas I'm thinking about the extinction of the species. So these philosophers of death, say, well, there's a big difference between dying and being dead. And you might say, okay, I believe that death is bad because of the suffering that process might inflict upon me. But once I'm gone, it doesn't matter. Other philosophers say, no, actually, that state or condition of no longer existing, that itself can also be a source of badness. This is sort of the deprivationist view, that being dead deprives us of certain goods, certain positive experiences that we could otherwise have. And so consequently, they would look at both of these aspects of dying as sources, at least potential sources of badness. So there's a kind of isomorphic situation with respect to human extinction. There's going extinct and being extinct. And yeah, I think this is just like, it's really fundamental. It's really crucial to keep these in mind, because you might say that, for example, you might be a pro-extinctionist, right? So you believe that being extinct would be better than being extant or continue to exist. That is entirely consistent with also saying that it would be absolutely terrible if we went extinct in a catastrophe, right? So you might be a pro-extinctionist who says, okay, look, by far the most probable ways that we're going to go extinct is as a result of a catastrophe. That would inflict lots of suffering on people. It would cut life short, and those things would be very bad. Therefore, we should do everything we can to prevent an extinction, an extinction-causing catastrophe from happening. So, okay, that sounds
reasonable.
Reasonable, yeah. But they would add that, okay, if extinction does happen, there is a silver lining, right? Because being extinct is better than being extant or continuing to exist. So, yeah, that gestures at the importance of this idea. And so, I really think there are three main positions within existential ethics. And within these three main categories, there are all sorts of different variations. One is the pro-extinctionist view. And the big practical ethical question that arises for them is, how do you bring about being extinct if you believe that that is better than continuing to exist? And you had hinted at this earlier, that there are sort of three main options on the menu. One is antinatalism. We all stop procreating. Another is promortalism, whereby we take our own lives. And then the third is omnicide, or literally defined as the murder of everyone. And the vast majority of pro-extinctionists think that omnicide is completely morally unacceptable, and that the only permissible route from here to there, from being extant to being extinct, is antinatalism. Is even more than that, it's a voluntary, uncoerced antinatalism. So people choosing on their own, without being manipulated in any way, to not have kids until the human population dwindles to zero. So that's, pro-extinction is one of the main views. The equivalence view is another primary position. And this basically says that being extinct is morally irrelevant. And one way of fleshing that out is to say that if there's nobody around, to bemoan the non-existence of humanity or the non-existence of the happiness that could have existed, the scientific achievements that could have happened, the great works of art that could have been produced, and so on. If there's nobody around to bemoan or suffer the non-existence of those things, then who exactly is harmed? And if nobody is harmed, then where is the badness or the wrongness of that situation? So that's why the equivalence theorists would say that being extinct is morally irrelevant. That said, going extinct absolutely could be very, very bad. Again, if there's lots of suffering or lives cut short, they would say that that process of going extinct would be very bad. The key idea with the equivalence views is that the badness or wrongness of extinction is equivalent to the badness or wrongness of going extinct. End of story. So actually, there's no unique moral problem posed by human extinction. Everything you might want to say about extinction can be said in ordinary moral language. So murder is wrong. Therefore, murdering 8 billion people is wrong. But there's nothing beyond that. All of the opportunity costs of no longer existing, all of the lost value, that's just not morally relevant. And then the last view is further loss theorists who would point to those opportunity costs and the lost value and so on and say that no, that is like very morally relevant. In fact, if there were an extinction causing catastrophe, the worst aspect of our extinction wouldn't be that 8 billion people would die. That would be very, very bad. But the worst aspect would be all of the lost future generations, all of that value, the art, the happiness, and so on. So that's why I call these further loss views, because they point to these further losses associated with being extinct.
Can I ask a question about the further loss view, which is a very, very interesting one? In a way, because we've already produced the science and the art and the literature and all that stuff, we've already produced quite a lot of it, and much of it is still around, and digitized even. There's a sense in which we've already got an insurance policy against the further loss view, right? Because in a sense, there's enough out there that even if we, the biological humans, were to disappear, there's still this stuff that's lying around, and it is done in a way that can be accessed because it's largely information-based, this stuff. And so it could be accessed by differently embodied beings if they're able to decode what's going on. And that could mean extraterrestrials. That could mean, computer programs or whatever. And in that respect, then there might be a way of regenerating humanity, perhaps not in the original biological form, but in a way that preserves the value that these guys are worried about being lost over the, millennia, So what do you make about that? Because I do read that, because in a way the further loss theory is kind of the most sophisticated kind of issue about when you calculate the loss of humanity. But it's not that, do we really need to have an endless stream of science, art, and literature produced by endless offspring? Isn't there enough there, as it were, in supply, that if we wanted to that if some being wanted to regenerate the human in the future, they could do that?
Yeah, it's interesting.
So is this the best it's going to get? And should we
No, I'm just saying, because if we're always talking about this in very generative terms, and there's a sense in which if it's generative, then there's a base from which it generates, and it's not clear that the base has to be infinitely large or something.
Yeah, well, one of the one version of a further loss view is totalist utilitarianism. Long-termism is arguably a bit broader than that, but underlying both or motivating both is this notion that the future could be much bigger than the present. And then there's this ethical or axiological component which states that bigger is better. And so we do have this sort of...
You're writing that down, Luke. Yeah.
Throwing the word progress down.
Yeah. So I think you're also getting at why further loss theorists tend to be much more concerned primarily with final extinction, right? Because it really matters that we continue to have. So maybe we disappear, but we've created this this accumulation, this wealth of knowledge, these the infrastructure of civilization, so on. We disappeared. That's fine, so long as there are successor beings that can carry this along, and ultimately to maximize the total amount of value in the universe. Again, bigger is better.
One context where this point kind of comes up, it's somewhat orthogonal to what we're talking about, but what first led me to think this way, before reading Derek Parfit and all that, was Popper. When Popper defines objective knowledge in what he calls the World Three in his book Objective Knowledge, this is how he does it, right? For him, knowledge is objective if it could be, if you had, as it were, all the files, all the library still preserved, all the human beings are gone, but because this stuff is codified as information, right, it could be regenerated and it could be reenacted, and you could, as it were, build a version, a 2.0 version of what this human civilization had been, and that, he said, is what makes knowledge objective, is that capacity in the information, that it could be reactivated by a totally different sort of being. Otherwise, there's no clear ontological criteria for objectivity. This was his argument.
I mean, the question is whether we will just rediscover this stuff anyway, whether if there is some form of grand narrative or history for humanity, that if we do go extinct and come back in some other form or substrate, that we will end up with science and art and all of these things in the first place. But I do want to return to that question of moral and whether causing our extinction would be morally right or wrong, because it feels like maybe a way to do it is to use the framework that you use in your book and almost pick your choice of existential ethics and then pick your type of extinction and then put them in dialogue to answer the question of whether that form of extinction is morally right or wrong.
Yeah. Assuming a pro-extinctionist perspective, would final extinction, is that a type of extinction we should try to bring about? Because they can be matched in all sorts of different ways. I mean, I argue in the book, and this is continuing what I had just mentioned, that further loss theorists tend to be most concerned with really three types of extinction: final extinction, normative extinction, and premature extinction. And premature extinction could take the form of normative or final extinction, but again, it has this sort of teleological dimension to it, according to which when extinction in the final normative senses happens matters morally. And so why are further loss theorists mostly concerned with final and normative extinction? Because those are the two types of extinction that are that would guarantee the loss of what matters to them. So the loss of all future value, all future happiness, which could be astronomical in its quantity, the loss of future scientific advancements, the development of the arts, even development of the humanities. Or if you're someone like Hans Jonas, who has a particular kind of further loss theorist that is quite distinct from totalist utilitarianism and long-termism, according to which the reason that the disappearance of humanity would be very bad is that we are the only beings capable of taking moral responsibility in the universe. So we're the only moral agents. Non-human creatures, they don't do anything morally wrong, even when they do something that is very bad, inflicts suffering on other creatures and so on. They're just not moral agents. So if we disappear, so consequently, he argues that we're the foothold of the moral universe within the physical universe. And he believes, and doesn't actually really argue for this, but he just takes it as sort of axiomatic, that it's better to have a moral universe within the physical universe. Consequently, we disappear, the moral universe is gone. That would be very bad. So it's this further loss view.
Yeah, but it's quite, and I think in his case, it's kind of a legacy of Christianity, or Judaism or something like this, right? Where the human is kind of constitutive of what gives meaning to everything, right? And so it's a kind of a legacy intuition, you might say.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you one more thing about the future loss stuff. From the standpoint of utilitarianism, because the way you talk about it, and I think it's correct, right? It places a lot of emphasis on the particular loss of human value. There wouldn't be the art and the science and all the rest of it. But utilitarians, I mean, especially if you think about Peter Singer and people like this, right? I mean, if they were doing kind of a totalitarian utilitarian thing, right, it would include animals and their, and their capacity for experiencing the world and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are there any of these further lost people who kind of bring animals into the equation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So maybe before trying to answer that, I'll just add one last thing, if you don't
Sure.
mind, about Hans Jonas, because the whole reason of mentioning him is that there's if what matters is the continued existence of the moral universe, then there's a question of, well, what types of extinction are sufficient for eliminating that moral universe? Well, it's not terminal extinction, because there could be other creatures, maybe post-human species, that also are capable of having a moral responsibility, taking moral responsibility, and therefore that moral universe would continue. So it's final extinction and it's normative extinction that matters to him. And so from the further loss perspective, in the vast majority of cases, final and normative extinction are the main targets of discussions about the badness or wrongness of human extinction, not these other types of extinction. Maybe for instrumental reasons, we want to avoid demographic extinction, because if demographic extinction happens tomorrow, it will entail terminal and final extinction. But intrinsically, there's nothing bad about demographic extinction of our particular species. Okay, so having said that, you're totally right that animals should be considered,
especially by utilitarian, right? I mean, from the utilitarian side, because Hans Jonas is not coming from utilitarianism, but Parfit and all these other guys are.
Yeah, so I think there are two aspects of this question that are maybe worth focusing on. One is this idea goes back to Henry Sidgwick. Mm-hmm. In his 1874 book, The Methods of Ethics, where he just has this really fascinating passing remark about human extinction. And he says, if everybody decided to be celibate and consequently the human species stopped existing, that would be the greatest of conceivable crimes, to quote him. And one of the reasons is that, sure, if humanity disappears, other non-human species will persist, but humans have a greater capacity for happiness as well as suffering than other species. So the universe loses something significant if humans disappear, even if non-human creatures continue. Because we're from the utilitarian view, sentient creatures are basically just the containers of value.
That's right.
We are bigger containers than other creatures by virtue of our more developed capacities for conscious experience and so on. So you eliminate all these bigger containers, then you lose, much more value.
So this is more John Stuart Mill than Jeremy Bentham.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right. That's, yeah.
And then also I think there's this view which seems scientifically plausible that if our species disappeared, it maybe would be improbable for non-human species to evolve into creatures that have our sorts of capacities. So, I mean, this is debatable. Like Stephen Jay Gould famously said, if the tape of evolutionary history were rewound, like, I don't know, maybe just a million years or something, you'd have to play it over and over again of a large number of times to get something that resembles humans. So we are just, here by chance. Others like Ernst Mayr have made the case that intelligence may be a lethal mutation. And that's why we don't see more like quote unquote intelligent species like supposedly us.
Darwin also had a kind of view like that. He was very suspicious about the prognosis for beings that had as large forebrains as we do, because we can imagine and think about so many crazy things that are totally unrelated to our survival capacity.
Well, I guess that is my final question, because we have that ability to think about end times, to project possibilities into the future. So why, I guess, is it so important to bring these sometimes very depressing ideas to the fore, to have the discussion of maybe avoiding or engaging with human extinction?
I believe the capacity to picture the future, which may be unique, at least to some extent, to humans, is chronesthesia. Just a fun term.
Chronesthesia.
If there are any logophiles watching, it's a great word to know about. So yeah, I don't know. I would say, on the one hand, I think the topic of humanity's future is just kind of intrinsically interesting. That's one reason I would recommend people study this topic. It's amazing to understand the different ways that humans have imagined our collective future in the universe over time. Also, at least, or I should say maybe especially in the Western tradition, these visions of the end time have played an enormous role in all sorts of very important historical events and developments and so on. One could argue that visions of the future of humanity, utopian or apocalyptic, have played an integral role in some of the biggest conflicts in human history. So, World War II, Hitler talked about the 1,000-year Reich. He drew a lot from, the Christian eschatology and certain motifs within standard Christian visions of the future. Going outside the Western tradition, the Taping Rebellion, which was probably the second most violent conflict in human history, that involved an apocalyptic utopian movement. The Taping Heavenly Kingdom, which we were fighting the King dynasty, I believe. So anyways, there's just, huge number of deaths. A lot of, terrorist attacks are the result of certain eschatological beliefs. So it's important to understand the different ways that people have imagined humanity's future, both secular, religious, and scientific. But also, we do live in this age of heightened existential hazards. And a lot of people will argue that the probability of some kind of anthropogenic extinction event this century may be higher than ever before in human history. It seems like the likelihood of human extinction, for example, in the 18th century or something, was just extremely low, because the only ways that we might go extinct were natural, and the probability of a very large asteroid or comet slamming into Earth, or there being a super volcanic eruption, something like that, is very low. And maybe going back to 75,000 years, there was a super volcanic eruption, the Toba catastrophe, which may have nearly wiped us out. That was a close call, but otherwise, we just haven't encountered any sort of major catastrophes. Suddenly, fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, 1952, we invent thermonuclear weapons. In 1954, we realized that even a small-scale thermonuclear conflict could blanket Earth with enough, at least potentially enough, radioactive particles, which give off ionizing radiation, which affect our DNA, can cause cancer, but also can affect our germline. So our children, our children, as a result, will be, mutants, and people suddenly start to worry about the slow disintegration and deterioration of humanity over the next few generations, potentially leading to our extinction. So fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, we've got thermonuclear weapons. We're inventing, genetic engineering techniques. These days we have synthetic biology, CRISPR-Cas9, digital to biological converters, and so on, just technologies that are incredibly powerful. And we seem to have created a situation in which the probability of a global scale catastrophe that might very well lead to everybody on Earth perishing is higher than ever. And even if you are an equivalence theorist who says that being extinct doesn't matter because there's just nobody around to suffer the loss of humanity, you will still say that 8 billion people dying is just an unimaginable, horrific tragedy. So we should take seriously this possibility that we might, through terror or error, kill, all 8 billion people on Earth. That would be very, very, very bad. Even if you're a pro-extinctionist, most of them are motivated by a deep concern and a feeling of compassion for other creatures on Earth, including other humans. And so most, compassionate or humane pro-extinctionists would agree that some kind of catastrophe, maybe involving an engineered pandemic or artificial superintelligence, something like that, resulting in the death of everyone on Earth, that would be just unimaginably horrendous. So thinking about human extinction, I think, couldn't be more relevant and timely. And it's extremely unfortunate that that is the case, that we happen to live in a moment in human history where human extinction is just like absolutely imaginable, that it could happen within our lifetimes. So that points at why I think this topic really matters, perhaps more today than ever before.
So I do teach this course on the sociology of end times, and so I can say something about students get very energized by the topic, and I think it's because it forces them to, deal with the meaning of life, right? And whether life is worth living, their own life, and also human life more generally, and so when you start asking questions, this sort of Derek Parfit style questions about what's the difference between annihilating everyone and keeping 1% around, and that really does get them focused. And not only that, I think that if one is, as it were, being realistic about the existential threats that face us, whether we're talking about climate change or nuclear war or, COVID or whatever, it's, the worst case scenario is that there will still be some people around. So this kind of issue that Parfit raises, which really focuses students' minds a lot, is in a way quite relevant for kind of what I think is a kind of realistic baseline with regard to the existential threats, which is, but then that forces some students to kind of make a really strongly, pro-mortalist kind of move and say, well, no, that's not good enough. We need to get rid of humans altogether because they're a blight on the planet and so forth. But they want to do it in a way usually that keeps the animals around, and that's where the issue about rebooting the world, should the world be rebooted, which is the question I ask the students, is actually quite tricky to answer because in a sense, if you think humans really are distinctly a problem with the world from a moral standpoint, but the rest of the world is fine, right? Then that's a tricky kind of thing to actually be able to realize. That kind of extinction is quite difficult to realize, and so students are forced to engage in that kind of manner. And I think the one background thing I would say that kind of makes this in a way very jarring for the students is, while it is true, of course, that we have all these existential threats hanging over us, we're also living in this period where not just transhumanists, but all kinds of people are talking about, the world's never been so good before. We're living longer than ever, and people are spending a lot of money still trying to live longer and take over the planet, the universe, and we don't have enough humanity, right? We need to go out there and we need to overpopulate everything. I mean, there's that, and the Elon Musk type people, and these guys, have a lot of followers as well. And so there is, especially if you're a young person and you're following this, you're getting these kind of really contrasting intuitions, about whether, we're going to destroy ourselves or whether we're on the verge of blasting off into heaven. I mean, and then of course, there are the religious people who contribute to this. but it's very energizing, very much on the money sort of topic now.
Well, we've survived this conversation, all 90 minutes of it, and on that, I guess, no, unless, Emile, it felt like you were about to respond to something Steve said there about...
I was just going to mention that is an absolutely excellent point. I've thought about this explicitly and tried to explain to people that there is no contradiction between saying that life is better than ever right now, and also that the probability of total annihilation may be higher than ever. I happen to be skeptical for many reasons about the Steven Pinker thesis about progress. So
that's next week in my class, actually.
Okay, fascinating. Yeah. But yeah, it's nonetheless, the fact is that there are these two narratives that are quite prominent, and it is really interesting to see how they interact. They prima facie contradict each other, but they don't necessarily.
Right. Yes, true.
So yeah, I don't know. It is all of that is to say that it's such an extraordinary, unique, strange, and fascinating moment to be alive. You know?
For as long as we are.
For as long as we are. We never had it so good, so let's keep it a little bit more of this. And on that somewhat hopeful note, Emile and Steve, I just want to thank you for being guests on the Futures podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah.
Thank you to Emile and Steve for detailing the wide range of historical and ethical perspectives surrounding the topic of human extinction. You can find out more by purchasing Emile's latest book, Human Extinction, A History of the Science and Ethics of Annihilation, available now. More about Steve's work, books, and his Sociology of End Times University module can be found at profstevefuller.net. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.